Imagine this. You are naked, running for your life across 200 miles of raw, savage wilderness. Your feet are bleeding on sharp rocks and cactus. Behind you, a band of Blackfeet warriors, armed and mounted, are hunting you for sport. Your partner is already dead. You have no weapon, no water, no food, and no clothes. The sun is setting, and the only hope for survival is a tiny, long-shot fort that no one expected you to reach. This is not a work of fiction. This is the true story of John Colter, the man who was swallowed by the American wilderness and somehow spit back out. Before there was a national park, before there was a map, there was Colter, and his incredible, solitary journey into the heart of what the world would later call Yellowstone. The year is 1806. The air hangs thick and heavy over the Pacific coast, a landscape still whispering with the ancient silence of unmapped territory. Most of America's boldest adventurers, the men of the Corps of Discovery, led by Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, are turning east, eager for the comforts of home after a grueling 2-year trek to the sea and back. But not all of them. Among the returning party, one man's eyes are still fixed on the horizon, not the road home. This man is John Colter. Born in Virginia around 1774, Colter was a hunter and a scout, a quiet, lean man whose physical endurance was already a legend among the Corps. His original contract with Lewis and Clark expired the moment they reached the Mandan villages in present-day North Dakota on the return journey. Most celebrated, most wept with relief. Colter felt a different pull. On August 13, 1806, as the expedition prepared to continue their journey east toward St. Louis, they encountered 2 commercial trappers, Forrest Hancock and Joseph Dixon, heading west, back into the unknown. They carried the lure of beaver pelts, the true gold of the American West. Lewis and Clark had successfully charted a path for empire. Colter saw a path for a life untethered. He asked for his discharge, an unheard-of request at the moment of triumph. Clark, with a mix of awe and worry, granted it. Colter turned his back on the congratulations and fame waiting in St. Louis and headed upriver with Dixon and Hancock. He had officially become one of the first mountain men, a breed of solitary, self-reliant adventurers who lived by their wits, their rifle, and their deep knowledge of the land, laying the literal groundwork for the western frontier. Colter's first foray back into the wilderness lasted about a year before his partners decided they'd had enough. But as he paddled down the Missouri toward St. Louis in the spring of 1807, he ran into yet another expedition moving upriver. This was a larger, better-equipped party led by the formidable Manuel Lisa, a Spanish-American fur trader and entrepreneur. Lisa was establishing Fort Raymond, also known as Fort Manuel, at the confluence of the Big Horn and Yellowstone rivers, a crucial outpost in what would become Montana. Lisa recognized a rare commodity in Colter, a man who knew the terrain, spoke some native languages, and had survived under the command of the 2 most successful wilderness explorers in American history. He offered him a better deal, and once again, Colter traded civilization for the scent of wood smoke and the promise of endless space. He agreed to become a hunter for the new fort, which meant he would spend his time in the vast, dangerous territory alone, trapping and scouting. It was during this time that John Colter made 2 incredible, historically significant journeys. The first was the winter of 1807 to 1808. Colter was dispatched by Lisa on a mission of diplomacy and trade to visit the Crow Nation and other tribes to encourage them to trade at the new fort. What followed was a solo 500-mile odyssey through country no other white man had ever seen. He traveled through the Yellowstone River Valley, saw the peaks of the Teton Range, and discovered the stunning geothermal features of what would eventually become Yellowstone National Park. When he returned to Fort Raymond, his descriptions of the land were so bizarre, boiling mud, water spouting into the sky, and foul-smelling steam vents, that his fellow trappers scoffed and mocked him, labeling the area Colter's Hell. The educated men in St. Louis would later dismiss his accounts as the tall tales of an unschooled frontiersman. But Colter had seen a wonderland, and he was the first American to chart its interior. His wanderings would eventually lead to the creation of the first reliable map of this immense, mysterious region. Colter's life of solitary exploration was always a high-stakes gamble, but the ante was raised dramatically in 1808. The danger lay primarily with the Blackfeet Nation, a powerful and expansionist tribe who viewed the growing presence of American trappers as an invasion of their hunting grounds. The Blackfeet were a formidable adversary, renowned for their skill in warfare and their fierce protection of their land. The most famous and unbelievable chapter of Colter's life, Colter's Run, occurred in the autumn of 1808. Colter was trapping beaver with a partner named John Potts. On the Jefferson River near Three Forks, Montana, the confluence of the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers, which form the Missouri. It was a beautiful but perilous location. As they paddled their canoe, they heard the telltale rush of hundreds of horses on the riverbank. They were instantly surrounded by 600 Blackfeet warriors. Potts, panicking, was immediately shot and killed, his body left to the current. Colter, knowing he was hopelessly outnumbered, surrendered immediately, trusting his remarkable composure to save him. The Blackfeet stripped him completely naked and held him at gunpoint. They debated how best to kill the intruder. Rather than executing him swiftly, their chief, seeing the lean, sinewy form of the man who had intruded on their land, decided to make a spectacle of it, a ritual of the hunt. The chief gestured to Colter, asking him if he was a good runner. Colter, who was in extraordinary physical condition from years of endless trekking, wisely played humble and said he was merely a slow one. The chief declared a sporting chance, a run for his life. Colter was granted a small head start, perhaps 100 yards, and then the whole war party would hunt him down. Colter stood on the edge of the prairie, a naked man facing 600 armed pursuers, a raw canvas of life and death. He took a deep breath, and the chief gave the sign. Colter didn't hold back. Despite his feigned weakness, he ran with every ounce of strength and desperation, a human projectile fired into the sagebrush. He had years of experience running from danger and traversing rough terrain, and his body responded with a primal, adrenaline-fueled burst of speed. The warriors let out a triumphant war cry and began their pursuit, expecting the terrified man to be an easy kill. Colter ran flat out for an incredible distance, about 5 to 6 miles before he dared to look over his shoulder. He had put so much distance between himself and the main group that only one Blackfoot warrior, a man whose endurance was as legendary as Colter's, was in close pursuit. Colter, now dizzy and gasping for air, suddenly stopped, wheeled around, and spread his arms wide. The lone warrior, shocked by the abrupt halt, stumbled and threw his lance, missing Colter but sticking into the ground. Colter then seized the moment. He wrestled the spear out of the ground, drove it through the startled warrior, and instantly killed him. The main Blackfeet party was now close enough to witness the shocking sight of their champion falling. Colter didn't wait. He snatched the fallen man's blanket for a makeshift covering and ran with renewed terror toward the nearest sanctuary, the Madison River. He reached the riverbank, plunged into the freezing water, and desperately swam to a huge floating log jam, a massive raft of timber that had become a small, hollow island in the river. He submerged himself in the icy water beneath the log jam, pulling his head just above the surface to breathe, completely invisible. The Blackfeet arrived at the river's edge, howling with rage at the sight of their fallen comrade and the sudden disappearance of their prey. They searched for hours, walking over the logjam, casting glances at the banks, furious that their victim had vanished into thin air. They could not believe a man could simply disappear. As darkness fell, the Blackfeet gave up, believing the wilderness or the cold river had claimed Colter's body. Colter remained under the logjam, half submerged in the glacial water, for what felt like an eternity. He waited until the absolute silence of the wilderness settled in long after the last hoofbeat had faded. When he finally emerged, naked, bleeding, and frostbitten, his ordeal was far from over. He was still 200 miles from the nearest outpost, Fort Raymond. For For the next 11 days, Colter navigated the unmapped wilderness, avoiding Blackfeet hunting parties, subsisting on roots and what small creatures he could catch, covered only by the warrior's blanket he had stolen. Finally, a ghost of a man, Colter staggered into Fort Raymond. His fellow trappers were stunned. They had mourned him as dead months ago. He had survived the ultimate test of the wilderness, a feat of physical and mental endurance that became a campfire legend known as Colter's Run. Colter's miraculous return to Fort Raymond was only a temporary respite. The Blackfeet, shamed and vengeful, continued to escalate their attacks on the American trappers. The pressure was relentless. Over the next 2 years, Colter fought in more skirmishes, narrowly escaping death multiple times. He was wounded and constantly on the move. The sheer, overwhelming brutality of the frontier finally wore down even his legendary resilience. In 1810, John Colter decided he had tempted fate enough. He had survived what no man should have. He had discovered a place that seemed born of myth, and he had established a legend that would outlive him. He headed east, finally making his way back to St. Louis. He had spent 6 years in the wilderness, 3 of them completely isolated after the Lewis and Clark expedition. His only possession of value was the extensive, intimate knowledge of the land he had acquired. Once in St. Louis, Colter didn't try to capitalize on his fame or his story, which was already beginning to circulate. He was a man of action, not words. Instead, he simply got married to a woman named Sally and settled on a farm in Missouri, the very picture of quiet domesticity. He passed on his valuable geographic information to William Clark, now the superintendent of Indian Affairs in St. Louis, who used Colter's accounts to draft the definitive map of the West in 1814. On this map, the region he described was officially labeled Colter's Hell. John Colter, the man who had outrun an army and survived the boiling mud of Yellowstone, passed away peacefully on his farm in 1813, not from a Blackfeet lance, a grizzly bear attack, or starvation, but likely from jaundice, a cruel irony for a man who had faced down every other danger the continent could throw at him. His story, once just a legend whispered around campfires, is a core piece of American history. It defines the spirit of the early frontier, the raw courage, the unbreakable will, and the unbelievable physical grit required to open up the continent. Colter was the pathfinder to one of America's most precious treasures, Yellowstone, and a quiet legend whose astonishing true story of survival is more incredible than any fiction. While his most famous adventures were over by 1810, Colter did have a final chapter: retirement. After his last terrifying encounter with the Blackfeet, Colter chose to leave the mountains and return to a farming life in Missouri, marrying and settling down. He died relatively young, around 1813. The Mapmaker. Colter's real lasting sequel was the information he provided to William Clark, of Lewis and Clark fame. Clark used Colter's routes and discoveries, including his description of the Yellowstone region, to create a map of the Western Territories in 1810. This map was the first to show the location of Colter's Hell, the geysers and hot springs of Yellowstone, providing the blueprint for later exploration. The next generation of mountain men, 1820s to 1840s. Colter's pioneering work in the Rockies paved the way for the golden age of the fur trade and a new generation of equally legendary figures. This era saw the rise of the rendezvous system, where trappers and traders would meet annually to exchange furs for supplies. Key figures who took up the torch: Hugh Glass, 1823. The man whose story is fictionalized in the film The Revenant is the perfect next figure. While he never met Colter, Glass's legendary 200-mile crawl for survival after being mauled by a grizzly bear cemented the mountain man archetype in American folklore. Jim Bridger, 1822 to 1860s. Bridger started his career young and would become a legend for his vast geographical knowledge. He also explored the Yellowstone region, though later than Colter, and was one of the first non-natives to see the Great Salt Lake. He later became an Army scout and guide for wagon trains on the Oregon Trail. Jedediah Smith, 1822 to 1831. A deeply religious man, Smith was one of the first Americans to travel overland to California, and later the first to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains from west to east. His explorations were incredibly significant in charting the Southwest. Kit Carson and Jim Beckwourth were other famous names that followed, with Jim Beckwourth being particularly notable as an African-American mountain man and war chief of the Crow Nation. The shift from trapper to guide. The ultimate sequel to the mountain man story is their transition from fur trappers to guides and scouts. By the 1840s, the beaver fur trade had largely declined due to over-trapping and a change in fashion. Silk hats replaced beaver hats. Many of the men who knew the western trails better than anyone, like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson, began guiding the massive wave of pioneers and emigrants heading west on trails like the Oregon Trail. They became the human atlases that opened up the entire transcontinental journey for settlement. The Wilderness Retaliates. The Rise of Hugh Glass, 1823. John Colter's astonishing survival and his quiet death in 1813 marked the end of the first wave of Rocky Mountain exploration. But the scent of beaver and the lure of unmapped territory were too strong to contain. The action now shifts forward a decade, into the 1820s, the true golden age of the mountain man. The solitary trappers of Colter's day were replaced by large, aggressive commercial ventures like the Ashley Henry Company, which sought to dominate the trade along the upper Missouri River. In 1823, a grizzled 30-something frontiersman named Hugh Glass signed on with this company. Glass's background was already a legend whispered around frontier fires, tales of being a sailor captured by the infamous pirate Jean Lafitte, followed by years living among the Pawnee Nation, where he learned the deep, necessary lore of the land. He was a survivor of a different, more brutal sort than Colter, yet their destinies were connected by the merciless nature of the wilderness. Glass and the company, led by Major Andrew Henry, were deep in the present-day Dakotas, following the Grand River, when fate, in the form of a mother grizzly bear defending her cubs, intervened. The grizzly and the betrayal. The attack was savage and swift, unlike the calculated threat posed by the Blackfeet to Colter. While scouting ahead for game, Glass stumbled directly between a female grizzly and her two cubs. The bear, enormous and enraged, charged. Glass had only a moment to fire his rifle before the creature was upon him. The bullet slowed her, but did not stop her. What followed was a mauling of unimaginable ferocity. The bear savaged Glass, biting, tearing, and clawing, ripping chunks of flesh from his body and crushing his bones. His ribs were broken, his throat was torn open, and his back was a lacerated ruin. Only the desperate intervention of his fellow trappers, who eventually managed to kill the bear, saved him from immediate death. But the rescue was hollow. Glass was alive, but barely. He was a pulpy mess of broken bones and torn tissue, unable to speak or move, simply breathing shallowly in a pool of his own blood. The expedition was in a desperate hurry. Winter was approaching, and they were hundreds of miles from the nearest fort. Carrying Glass would mean the death of the entire party. Major Henry made a grim decision. He offered $80 to any two men who would stay behind with the dying man, ensure he received a proper burial, and then catch up to the main party. Two men volunteered: John Fitzgerald, a hardened trapper driven by the lure of the money, and a young, terrified Jim Bridger, then only 19, at the very beginning of his legendary career. For 2 agonizing days, Fitzgerald and Bridger watched Glass. He seemed to defy the natural order, remaining alive even when every indicator pointed to his imminent demise. Fitzgerald grew impatient and greedy. He convinced young Bridger that Glass was already a corpse waiting to rot. The two men made a despicable decision. They dragged Glass into a shallow grave they had prepared, quickly covered him, and then, most insultingly, stole his rifle, knife, and gear, leaving him naked, defenseless, and abandoned to the mercy of the elements. The crawl. 200 miles of unbreakable will. When Glass regained full consciousness, he was lying alone in a shallow grave, his life stripped away piece by piece. His only motivation was not survival, but vengeance. He had to find Fitzgerald and Bridger, and he needed his rifle. What followed rivals and arguably surpasses Colter's run for sheer, sustained suffering. His nearest refuge was Fort Kiowa, an outpost roughly 200 miles southeast, near the confluence of the Missouri and White Rivers. Glass could not walk. His leg was severely broken and his wounds were septic. He began to crawl. For 6 weeks, Glass dragged his body across the prairies and through the river bottoms of the Great Plains. His pace was torturous, sometimes only a few miles a day. Subsistence? He lived on the raw organs of a baby bison calf left behind by wolves and foraged for berries and roots. Wound treatment? To prevent gangrene and to protect his exposed back wounds, he would lie on wet sand and allow maggots to clean the putrefying flesh, an ancient and effective, though horrifying form of natural surgery. He even used a decaying buffalo hide as a makeshift cast and covering. The river. Eventually, Glass reached the Cheyenne River, where he fashioned a crude round bull boat, a bull-shaped raft of buffalo hides stretched over willow branches, and used the river current as his motor. When he finally stumbled, exhausted and unrecognizable, into Fort Kiowa, he was a living specter. His story instantly became the most compelling, horrifying, and inspirational tale of the American frontier. Hugh Glass had literally crawled out of his own grave. He was a revenant, one who has returned from the dead. The pursuit and the irony of forgiveness. Glass's immediate consuming need was to find his betrayers. First target, Jim Bridger. After a period of recovery, Glass took up with another trapping party and began his relentless search. He tracked the group up the Missouri and eventually found Jim Bridger at the mouth of the Bighorn River. The confrontation was set to be deadly, but when Glass saw the terrified, remorseful young man, likely just a pawn swayed by Fitzgerald's greed, his fury cooled. He could not bring himself to kill the teenager. He spared Bridger, settling for a harsh verbal dressing down and a pointed warning. Second target, John Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald had since fled the mountains and joined the U.S. Army, a move that offered him legal protection and an escape from the long arm of mountain man justice. He found him at Fort Atkinson in 1825. Glass burst into the fort, demanding his rifle and Fitzgerald's life. However, killing a soldier in a federal fort was an act of treason that would bring the wrath of the U.S. government down on the fur trade. An officer, likely recognizing Glass in the righteousness of his cause, intervened. He forced Fitzgerald to return Glass's stolen Houcken rifle and compensated Glass for the loss of his supplies. Glass was a man defined by the wild code of the mountains, but he was also a pragmatist. He had his gun back, and the promise of a life for a life was not worth throwing his own freedom away. In an act of true, unbelievable frontier restraint, Hugh Glass walked away, leaving Fitzgerald alive. His ultimate revenge was simple. He was the man who lived, and Fitzgerald was the man whose cowardice was now known across the entire Western Territory. The Mountain Man's Sunset. Hugh Glass's life continued in the mountains until 1833, 8 years after his pursuit ended. He died not in a legendary solo venture, but in an ambush by Arikara warriors on the Yellowstone River, a sudden end that underscores the unrelenting danger of the wilderness. But the mountain man had served his purpose. The stories of Colter, Glass, Bridger, and others, their impossible treks, their defiance of death, their discoveries of hidden wonders, were the first myths of the American West. They broke the trails and charted the rivers. When the beaver trade collapsed in the 1840s, the legends became the guides. Men like Jim Bridger became the essential roadmaps for the first great migration of American settlers, the pioneers flooding west on the Oregon Trail. The trappers were gone, replaced by the farmers and the miners, but the paths they opened, the maps they drew, and the astonishing true tales of their lives, from Colter's hell to Glass's revenant crawl, had permanently etched the wild heart of America onto the national consciousness, transforming an unknown wilderness into a frontier of endless possibility. The price for that knowledge was paid in blood and solitude, and the men who paid it remained the most enduring, astonishing figures in American history.